way, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to your morning briefing for Tuesday, the 29th of April, 2025. I'm your host, Mike Shelby. By the way, let's just start off with today's show. I just saw this. It didn't make it into the report, but it's this Axios report. Quote, most Americans see Trump as a dangerous dictator, poll says. And I'm reading through this, and it says about 52% of all Americans agree with the statement. And let me just tell you what the statement is in this poll. They agree with this statement, quote, Trump is a dangerous dictator whose power should be limited before he destroys American democracy. I just thought this was very interesting. You know, you go in, you read the fine print, as everyone should do with polls. And the survey was conducted from February 28th to March 20th. So survey ended on March 20th. We're over a month away now, and we're hearing about the results. It seems oddly timed to me. I haven't even gone in to look at how much they're oversampling Democrats versus Republicans, but that's what Axios is reporting. They're running with it. All right, let's go ahead and jump inside the Beltway this morning. Robert, good morning. Let's start off with this bill to ban foreign adversary satellite licenses. So this is going to ban Chinese satellites from being launched in American airspace, or how does that work?
Good morning, Mike. Well, this is actually to bar the Federal Communications Commission from issuing these licenses to launch those satellites to certain private companies that are linked to foreign adversaries. And they've hinted that this is specifically targeting some of these Chinese telecoms that we've been warning about, that have access to things in the U.S. like the internet points of presence. And access to U.S. telecoms infrastructure. And I think what this is trying to head off those same security risks that we've covered that exist in our current earthbound telecoms, and prevent that situation from developing with our satellite infrastructure.
Mm-hmm. All right. Seems prudent. Let's also move on. I read this morning, Robert, and I thought, wow, it's 2025, and the House is passing a bill to map out our critical supply chains. But what's the latest here?
Yeah, this is the Promoting Resilient Supply Chains Act of 2025, and it was passed yesterday in the House. And it's directing the International Trade Administration to do exactly that: map critical supply chains, identify critical industry vulnerabilities to things like supply shocks, and then developing national strategy to try to boost domestic manufacturing of some of these critical goods. And yeah, this has been a long time coming. I think in multiple hearings over the last couple of years, it's been pointed out that our industry has not mapped critical supply chains even post-COVID.
Mm-hmm. How's that possible, Robert? How are we 5 years past the start of the COVID crisis, and knowing even before then, back in 2016, I believe, what's the guy's name? Steve Bannon. Back in 2016, he said, yeah, we're going to be at war with China in 5 years. So they were talking about this stuff back in 2016. We're almost 10 years later now, and we're just now mapping critical supply chains. Why does it take this long?
Well, I think most businesses just expected the status quo of, heavy Chinese imports, U.S. relying on imports for critical items like medicines and stuff, to just continue without disruption, aside from COVID, the acts of God disruptions they didn't expect. I think an actual trade war to continue expanding between the U.S. and China, so there was no incentive for them to actually map these supply chains where to see how reliant they are on Chinese and other foreign imports.
Mm-hmm. All right, and then let's move on here. I just noticed where Scott Bessent actually was speaking live just a few minutes ago. I guess maybe he's announcing an announcement over this X date. And just as a reminder, the X date is the day in which the Treasury Department will run out of funds. Is that correct?
Correct. And so he said he announced that that the Treasury Department's going to release his estimate for this X date by the end of this week or next week. And he was a little vague. But he did say that the Trump administration's goal is to have key portions of this budget reconciliation bill we've talked a lot about, which includes, importantly, a $5 trillion debt ceiling raise finished by the 4th of July. That seems to be skepticism from some major Republican figures over whether that's actually going to happen or not. And if it doesn't, I think we're going to see a fight over raising the debt ceiling in Congress, where I think Democrats have signaled they are willing to risk a debt ceiling breach to oppose the Trump administration.
Mm-hmm. I think that is, Robert, I agree. And it all goes back to that talk, and I shared the video with you earlier this month. Senator Chris Murphy, this is late in late March, he's given a town hall meeting to his constituents. He's a Democrat from Connecticut, Senator Chris Murphy. And he says, maybe we didn't take enough risks back during the continuing resolution, implying that Democrats should take greater risks regarding the fiscal situation, which is concerning. Let's move on here to the next items here. I'll let you take it from the top here, starting with Washington passing a strike unemployment benefits bill. Why does that matter?
Well, Washington Governor Bob Ferguson is expected to sign what's called Senate Bill 5041, and this would allow workers who are striking over a labor contract to draw state unemployment benefits. Washington wouldn't be the only state to do this. It also includes New York, New Jersey, and Rhode Island, and Oregon's also considering a similar bill. I think this is important because this is where we could see, there's a lot of talk about a 2028 general strike, and these May Day strikes. These are the states I think we would likely see more incentives for unionized workers to actually strike because they can draw these unemployment benefits for, I think in the Washington bill, at least 6 weeks for a strike, they can get unemployment payments.
So this is essentially a state directed strike fund. It's not actually unemployment. It's in
effect, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Amazing.
And then the State Department announced yesterday that they reached an agreement with Mexico's government to increase Mexico's water deliveries to the U.S. under the 1944 Water Sharing Treaty because they've had some major shortfalls. I think so far they've only provided about 1/3 of their obligation in the current 5-year cycle, which is up in October. The Texas Water Resources Institute said that Mexico just does not have a feasible option to make up that shortfall by October without impacting their agricultural sector and their own water security. So I think it's unlikely. I think Mexico's government is agreeing to this, obviously, because they don't want sanctions or industrial tariffs levied on them. But I don't think they're going to be able to make up this huge shortfall. And this is not the first time that they've missed their water sharing obligations, except for the previous Trump administration. They had a huge shipment to the U.S. right at the end to try to make up that 5-year cycle requirement. So I think, and especially in Texas and some other parts of the Southwest, where the water security situation is going to become worse because Mexico is just not going to be able to make up this shortfall.
Mm-hmm. So what does this mean? Water rationing? Are some of these communities in the Southwest, like in the border region, are they just going to run out of water or what?
I think we could see water rationing. That's something that California has done previously for residential use. I think we'll see the agriculture sector will probably gobble up a lot more of what is available, just because that seems to be on both sides of the border. Those are the two groups that have been pushing hard to get this water sharing obligation fixed or not fixed in Mexico's case. Mm-hmm.
And then finally, let's talk about this executive order from President Trump. I saw a lot of people freaking out over this. I don't think this is something people should freak out over. I think this is a good thing, actually. He's actually going to enforce isn't it already a law that in order to get your CDL, like you should probably be able to speak and read English?
Yeah, it's a federal regulation under the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. But in 2016, right at the end of the Obama administration, Obama directed the administration not to enforce that. And I think both the Obama administration and the Biden administration put pressure on states to not enforce English language proficiency tests for commercial driver's licenses. So there has been an increase of non-English proficient drivers in commercial trucks on U.S. highways. And we've seen a couple of high-profile fatalities from that. But I think a more important vulnerability here is the scenario we discussed before. Like if the U.S. loses GPS capability because of a crisis or conflict with a foreign adversary, well, now we have I think almost 10% of truck drivers are foreign-born non-citizens, and some percentage of them are not proficient in English. So I could see some disruptions in U.S. supply chains just because of that.
Mm-hmm. I remember during my enlistment process, I went down to MEPS, which is the Military Entrance Processing Station or something like that. And there was a guy right behind me, and he was from Haiti. And he did not speak English. I had to help him. I just showed him where to write his name on the form. And after that, I was like, dude, I cannot explain this to you. And I just said, this guy's not going to make it. He didn't make it, obviously, through basic training. I don't know how he got there without speaking English, but also on a CDL, how in the world do you pass a CDL test I'm assuming there's a written test like you take when you're 16, you go take your driver's license test. How are these guys? Are they taking them in Spanish language? I mean, is it written in Hindu? Like, uh, what is this? How do people
I
get a CDL without knowing English?
I think in some states there have been changes to the issuance of CDLs where they've allowed them not to take a written test. They just they go through a driver's school.
Mm.
I know in Canada, for example, which is having the same problem, there are driver schools that are effectively acting like CDL mills, where they'll take in a lot of foreign-born students and just essentially hand them a CDL, which has allowed their trucking industry to honestly be even worse off than us. But there is some intersection with the United States because Canadian truck drivers and American truck drivers cross the border regularly. So there are, non-English speaking Canadian CDL holders driving on U.S. highways and all around the border.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thanks for that, Robert. Let's move on. Jared, good morning. This is a little bit concerning. China's looking at decoupling from medical supplies with the United States. I guess they get some stuff from us to help produce medicine. What's going on?
Yes. So we focus a lot on APIs here for pharmaceuticals, but the Chinese government ordered
APIs,
the active pharmaceutical ingredient.
So precursor chemicals for pharmaceuticals. Yes. Okay.
The Chinese government ordered its medical industry to study how to reduce their dependence on U.S. made testing reagents, imaging equipment like MRIs and ultrasounds, and other medical consumables. And I noticed that this follows a very similar pattern. We've seen them partially decouple from aerotech industry, the aerospace technology industry, with them telling, even if you bought the Boeing planes, send them back. We've seen it now in medtech, food and energy. We just covered yesterday. It sounds a lot like they're trying to insulate themselves from a catastrophe here.
Jared, when you look at this, I look at this and I say, this does not look like a China that is about to come to the table and hammer out a good agreement with the Trump administration. This looks like a China that's expecting a worst case scenario here.
Yes, I find it hard to avoid the conclusion that they seem to think that war is inevitable. Just when you're getting rid of when you're telling your aerospace industry, don't take one of the top producers of airplanes. You're telling your med tech, don't take the top producers of medical technology. You're telling your agriculture and energy industries, don't take one of the major exports of these. Like, that sounds a lot like you are having to make that hard decision, and you know that it's going to go away one way or another.
Mm-hmm. All right, Jared, thanks for staying on top of that. Let's go ahead and move on to Japan.
Yes. So a couple of Japan's high-ranking officials, which they're members of Japan's ruling party, they conducted a joint interview yesterday and publicly called for Japan to lead the U.S.'s diplomatic efforts in Asia and Europe. The officials also intend to call for new rules in the United Nations Security Council, specifically to address a Taiwan contingency, and they're basing that off of the failure of the Ukraine contingency. The UNSC, they say, did not respond strongly enough because Russia, one of the belligerents, is part of that Security Council. They also want to help Europe understand China as a threat, as the premier security threat, understanding that Russia is a threat to Europe still. And they want to bring the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, fully on side. They are concerned that some of this tariff stuff has actually pushed them away. We've covered here. I don't think it truly has. Maybe made them, but I think this is very likely to happen because Japan unofficially took the lead in Asia between 2021 and 2025. The whole free and open Indo-Pacific concept that is frequently cited, that actually came from Japan. Japan's the one that's been pressing that. They're the ones that are getting that kind of stuff put into people's national security strategies. So I think we're likely to see Japan do this with or without the U.S.'s consent. And we're likely to see more cooperation between Japan and Europe in order to get Europe against China.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's move on to Southcom here. So in the past couple of years or so, the former U.S. Southern Command Commander, General Laura Richardson, went down to Ushuaia in Argentina, and there's a Argentine military or naval base down there. And it was kind of a big deal because everyone thought, well, kind of what's going on with this? And you look at the geography there, and you got the Strait of Magellan, you got the Beagle Channel, which, Jared, I'll be honest, this looks like to me that the United States and Argentina want to lock that down in order to maybe protect part of the Western Hemisphere. What say you?
That's exactly what it looks like to me. If you're going to avoid the Panama Canal and you, I don't know, don't have a port open in Peru or whatever, then this would be the route you have to take. Both of them, the Strait of Magellan is the one cutting through the continent there, and the you actually pass just north of Drake's Passage there if you're going outside of it. Either way, you have to go directly around Argentinian territory. It looks to me like they're kind of expanding for just North America to include this.
Mm-hmm. All right. So the new Southcom commander is on a 3-day visit. Any other pertinent details there?
No, I think the most important detail here is that they are assessing how the integrated naval base down there actually does protect these maritime routes. They are meeting with officials, but they didn't produce any details for what the intent is there.
Mm-hmm. All right. Interesting. And then let's talk about this European power outage. There's anytime this happens, there's a ton of conspiracy theories. Have they actually announced at least an official cause for what happened in Spain and Portugal?
Not that I've seen. They are immediately ruling out foul play, saying, hey, this does not look like a cyber attack. It doesn't look like it was an attack. But that really just leaves it was a failure of the grid, so we have to look at what composes the grid. It's almost 80% renewables. Here you've got I put in a line here so you can actually see how close that is to 80. It's clearly up over 70% of their production is renewables. This Spain and Portugal lost power for most of the day. They declared a state of emergency. And this actually even affected Andorra, which is a tiny country on the border, and France. They both reported minor power outages, but France has its own grid. And I think what happened there is a couple of safeties went into place. But if those safeties failed, here you can see on the right, Spain is part of the regional grid for continental Europe. If those safeties were to fail, you could have a cascade effect all the way through Europe. Mm-hmm. Now, I think the most important thing for this is actually to take a look at how everybody responds. What systems stay up, what systems go down. That way, if you're in a place that has a similar level of renewables, you can prepare for it.
Mm-hmm. I'll add this, Jared, just because I thought it was funny. There was someone on Twitter that said Spain is actually the perfect candidate for launching a cyber attack like this against the power grid. Because if you're successful and the power goes out, you could just blame it on Spanish incompetence and no one would think twice about it. And makes sense to me. All right. Thanks for that, Jared. Let's go ahead and move on here to our warning items. Robert, so Ray Dalio, legendary hedge fund manager, I started following him very closely back in 2016. He went to Davos. He said the United States is on track for a civil war. It is broadly going to be between capitalists and socialists. And this was not a YouTube personality. This was not, doomsday prepper or whatever. This was a hedge fund manager, a founder of the world's largest hedge fund for many years, if not decades, the world's most successful hedge fund, saying this. And he has really been beating this drum, not only on conflict, but on the end of the Western-led, quote-unquote, rules-based international order. And now he's saying this is too late for an orderly global restructure. He says we're on track for a disorderly global restructuring. What's going on?
Yeah, this was a recent article from Dalio, and he said that I think he's basically warning people who you can have an impact on policy. And he specifically calls out financial leaders and policymakers, saying that we're on the brink of the global order breaking down, both the monetary and political order, due to unsustainable bad fundamentals that he says can be easily seen and measured. And he also mentioned that he's talked to a lot of people in the business sector, both here and abroad, who are basically making plans to try to for like a decoupling from the United States. And he said that the U.S. fiscal situation is unsustainable, something he has warned Republicans in power for weeks now, back when they first started talking about these unfunded tax cuts in that reconciliation bill. And he also pointed out that he said, assuming that you can sell and lend to the U.S. and get paid back with hard currency on U.S. debt holdings is naive, and other plans have to be made. And the way, from what he wrote, my understanding is that a lot of people in other countries, a lot of financial sector, commercial sector people, both here and abroad, are making those plans. And I think this is also a warning to people here, policymakers here in the United States, that they're not moving within the window to actually prevent some of the worst outcomes that he predicts in his big cycle analysis.
Mm-hmm. So he has a book coming out, and I pre-ordered it on the day that he announced it, because I read all the Ray Dalio books, and it is on how countries go bankrupt. And it seems like this is a very pointed critique of what's going on with the United States, because you go back to his first major book. Well, I guess it was Principles. That was more of a self-help or self-development book. But the book directly after that was Principles for Navigating the Changing World Order, which is about how do you anticipate, how do you manage, and how do you make financial decisions during this period where the United States, I think he believes, is in terminal decline. I think he sees the Chinese world order as ascendant. And that's entirely what the book is about. I just want to point something out here. So this is from this little graph right here, shows the cycle from new orders, and then you get to the top of the order, and then you get the decline of the order. And so where we are right now, we're at least at 13. There's a different graph on here. Right in between 13 and 14, or right around 13, you have a big debt bust. And Ray Dalio, he studied, I don't know, probably 2,000 or 3,000 years of history. And he comes to these conclusions. If his theory is correct, which honestly I think it is, we are on track for a debt bust at some point because our debt is unsustainable. Everyone will talk about the $37 trillion in national debt. Few people recognize we have over $200 trillion in unfunded liabilities. And that's not money that you can trim out of the budgets. That's not money that you're going to tax out of the economy. There's two things that are going to have to happen. Number one, it's going to be printed away. And number two, bondholders are just going to have to take a haircut whenever we are forced into this debt restructuring. Robert, last thing I'll say is, back when I think this was late last year on the campaign trail, Scott Bessent was asked, who's the Treasury Secretary, he was asked, I think maybe, why are you doing this? And he said, because I think we're headed towards a new Bretton Woods agreement, and I want to be a part of that. So this is something that they have anticipated for a long time. Bretton Woods happened in 1944. It basically established the dollar as the world reserve currency. And he says we're headed towards a new Bretton Woods. I don't want to say that this guy, I've been impressed by Scott Bessent just personally. I think he knows what's going on. Robert, has Dalio said anything about what he anticipates will happen next?
He is one of the big things he's warned about is domestic unrest, civil unrest, because when you have, like, once we get to the post debt bust cycle of this decline of the American empire, a lot of his warnings have been about political unrest as well, political disintegration. And I think his warning has been pretty clearly that if Congress and the White House aren't able to act within this window that he said is closing, they're risking a major increase in just domestic political unrest and even sentiment for a political revolution.
Mm-hmm. People send me stuff from Martin Armstrong all the time, or they mention in the chat, Martin Armstrong said this, Martin Armstrong said this. Martin Armstrong said either this was the last election, or he said there will not be an election in 2028. And when I saw that, I said, well, sure, certainly that's a possibility. Sounds kind of extreme. And I don't know. I'm kind of coming around to maybe Martin Armstrong will be right about this. We'll start at 13, and I'll talk down the decline, and then we'll move on. So you have this debt bust when a country is no longer able to afford its debt. And some of that debt's going to be discharged. Bondholders are going to get a haircut. And this is when, we saw this in the pigs. Portugal, Italy, Greece, Spain, they basically just said, hey, we're bankrupt. We can't pay back these bonds. And so people were just, those countries went into austerity. They had massive domestic problems as a result of that. So Ray Dalio says the worst of the money printing actually we haven't seen it yet, which is surprising. But Dalio in his book says there's a lot more money to be printed. And you look at $37 trillion in debt, $200 trillion in unfunded liabilities. Obviously, there's going to be a lot more money being printed in our lifetimes. This is not a 20-year problem anymore. This is like a next 2-year problem, because it's very likely that the X date for Medicare and Social Security is not going to be in the 2030s. It's probably going to be in the late 2020s. So this is something that is going to happen much sooner rather than later. And then he said you get into internal conflict. So you get, this is a different chart, but you get debt and political restructuring. You get civil wars and revolutions. And Dalio says all throughout history, this is exactly what happens to these countries at the end of the world order. I will say this: it's not exactly what happened to Great Britain. I could be wrong. I'm not aware that they had a civil war from 1945 to 1956 in the Suez Crisis, which was their end of empire. But they certainly have gone down. They're still around, but they certainly have gone downhill. They have massive problems there. Remember, anything else you'd like to add on this Dalio piece?
So I think there's a major political obstacle to the Trump administration and the Congress, bipartisan Congress, being able to do anything about this. You mentioned the Medicare Social Security X date. So I was sat in on a teletown hall with my representative, Mike Herodopoulos from Florida's 8th District last night. And it illustrated something for me that I think is why this political obstacle exists, is that there are a lot of Americans who are willing to go to bat for their Social Security and Medicare, or future Social Security and Medicare benefits. But that is basically those two things are a major drag on the deficit and the U.S. fiscal situation. And I think that represents a major political obstacle to actually fixing this. And you can see that in how the Trump administration has responded to that, where Trump has come out and said, yeah, I'm not going to cut Medicare. I'm not going to cut Social Security. Even if that is even if they were to realize that might be a requirement to fix the fiscal situation, they don't have the political capital to do it or the willingness to do it. And so I think that's going to be a major factor in missing this window.
Mm-hmm. It's funny. And listen, I hate to belabor this point, but I'm just reminded, this book called The Fourth Turning, the original Fourth Turning book, which was published back in the 1990s, the authors said, well, just briefly, the fourth turning is a theory. It's a generational theory. And their argument is that you essentially have 4 turnings in a cycle. And the 4th generation of this 4-generation cycle is the conflict generation. So, the first is kind of the birth, and then second, third, and then you get around to the 4th, and they say it's always a conflict generation. They go back to the English Civil War, the American Revolution, the Civil War, World War II. And they've been saying that we are in the 4th turning now. The latest update said that's going to resolve broadly at some point in the 2030s, or maybe it'll peak around the year 2030. So the conflict generation will peak around 2030, which means there's more time left in this ball game. But in the original 4th turning, one of the trigger points that they said could trigger a 4th turning was austerity. And you really do have to wonder if at some point, as Ben mentioned in the chat, we either inflate our way out of this problem, or we do go through some austerity, or maybe, I don't know, tough times ahead. Thanks, Robert. Let's go ahead and move on. All right, Jared, give us an update on what's happening between India and Pakistan.
All right. Well, it looks like Balakistan is likely going to play a larger role than expected here. The several Indian state level ministers who are also members of the ruling party are vocally supporting the Balakistan liberation movement, saying that Pakistan is likely to be split in 2 in this war again, because one of the previous wars resulted in Pakistan splitting off from Bangladesh. At the same time, one of the other ministers said that the Balakistan movement, quote, stands as a symbol of indigenous peoples' enduring aspiration for dignity, rights, and control over their own destiny, which matches a lot of a lot of India's own mythos. That's how they point back to Gandhi. Now, I point all of this out because Balakistan holds a significant portion of Pakistan here, as you can see in red. And yesterday, the Pakistani defense minister had an interview where he said that Pakistan believes in an Indian incursion is imminent, and that all strategic decisions have already been made, along with a reinforcement of troops at the border. He was careful to say that Pakistan's on high alert, but would only use nuclear weapons if there's a direct threat to our existence. That caveat, though, I think could potentially be activated if the Balakistani movement does gain steam. And the issue with that is that Pakistan has repeatedly accused India of materially supporting what they call terrorists, which are normally just separatists inside of Pakistan. So a vocal support would basically be just an out and out, we are supporting you, and giving Pakistan no room for any other interpretation. Thus, you are threatening Pakistan's existence and potentially giving them casus belli for nuclear war.
Mm-hmm. All right. That's a pretty ugly scenario. Thanks for staying on top of this, Jared. You mentioned, who was it? The defense minister or something said that he expected some military incursion was imminent.
Yes, he consistently said incursion, though their publicly stated first use policy on nukes is a failing to repel an invasion. So I don't know if that was a mistranslation or if they actually intentionally used the word incursion to signify a military action below the level of an invasion. I'm still trying to figure that one out. And the incursion he's talking about is in the Kashmir region, which you can see highlighted in pink up on the map here. So I think as long as any kind of fighting stays limited to Kashmir, this will likely stay below a nuclear war because it's already disputed. It's been disputed for decades. And it's not a threat to existence as long as you can open up that dam.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thanks for that, Jared. And let's go ahead and move on to some of our questions today.
Right here.
All right, with Democrats, a question from X. I think this is our first question from X. With the Democrats pushing for rioting and violence again, do you foresee a bigger scale riot than the George Floyd riots? Thanks. No, I don't. I think it's too early. I don't think we're going to get George Floyded this summer. Could there be? There are obviously going to be mass protests. Could there be riots? Yes. I don't think they will be on the scale of George Floyd in 2020. I think we've got to hit 2017 levels of unrest first. I mean, remember, 2020 was the absolute peak of that entire movement, and it took 4 or 5 years to build. That 2020 stuff didn't pop off. I mean, it popped off in 2020, but it was building back in 2014, 2015. So it was a long time coming. It went through a long period, years-long period of acceleration before you had a trigger. And I don't think there's enough pressure built up into the system. Let's see what happens with the economy. If we have a recession, there's a lot of things that could be happening this summer that would be accelerants of something like this, like a violent social movement. I don't expect 2020. I expect 2020 to happen maybe next year, maybe in 2028. I think 2028 is probably the top contender if I just had to make a bet right now. So, no, I don't see anything bigger than 2020 this year. All right, in an India-Pakistan conflict, what are the likely goals, territory, crippling Pakistan's military, et cetera, that India seeks to achieve? How likely is it that they'd be successful? Well, Jared, it seems to me like if you're India, you want to prevent more terror attacks. So I think they're pretty limited in what they can do. I don't even think the Pakistani government can really go after all their terrorist groups there. I don't understand how the Indians are going to do it, but what say you?
That's the only stated goal I've seen from the Indians is we intend to pursue the people who did this to the ends of the earth, destroy them, and carry out. It does look like they're trying to seize Kashmir in totality as well, which if you're going to actually stop the attacks, getting rid of a disputed region, fully securing a disputed region would make sense.
Mm-hmm. All right. Wouldn't the troubles in Ireland be the Civil War uprising in the UK at the end of the empire? No, I don't think so, for a number of reasons. The troubles didn't start in the 1960s, 70s, 80s. They started back in the 1800s. Well, actually, I guess maybe you go even a lot sooner than that. But you had the Irish Civil War. You had the first troubles back in 1919 or so, somewhere around there, and then you had the Irish Civil War in 21 or 23, 24. I don't know, somewhere in there. So no, I think the troubles in the 70s were just an extension of that multi-100-year conflict. I guess you can go back to probably like, I don't know, the 12 or 1300s, or between the English and the Irish. So no, I wouldn't consider that the UK's end of empire civil war. Read the first fourth turning. Is the second one worth read? I think it is, with a couple of caveats. Neo Howe, I'm pretty sure he's a center left guy at least. I think it's worth the read just for the update. There's a lot of stuff, like, honestly, man, I don't care about the generations and the avatars for the generations. I forget whatever he calls them. That's a lot of, to me, that stuff is just, I don't know. It's mumbo jumbo to me, but I'm sure it's real science to other people. I don't know. But what I'm most interested in were his conclusions, and he does provide an update. He said the fourth turning will no longer peak in 2020. That's what they wrote back in the 1990s. Honestly, not a bad guess. But now he says this is going to extend into the 2030s, and he gives some demographic reasons for that. Like, I think he said generations are shorter or something like that. I forget exactly what he said. But just understand, when you read that book, it will have kind of I think it's biased towards the left. And the same with all the Peter Turchin stuff. Peter Turchin published a new book a couple of years ago too, called The End. I think The End is Here, which is about state breakdown, political disintegration. And he bluntly says the Republican Party is the revolutionary party, which I'm not sure. I mean, maybe you can make that case in the future. I wouldn't agree with that now. I would say Republicans are probably the counter-revolutionary party. But yeah, I think the second one's worth a read. Listen, you know what I did in the first one? I skipped to like the last 2 or 3 chapters, and I read his conclusion, and I said, that's good enough for me. I didn't actually even read the entire fourth turning. The first book, I read the second book in its entirety, but it's too dry. It's too boring for me to read. Has the Doge cleanup of the Social Security rolls extended the estimated solvency date? Listen, I don't believe so. I'll get Robert's take on this, but let me just point something out. When you look, CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, they're the ones who produce this timeline of when they think Social Security is going to run out of money. And when you look at the CBO scoring, it is predicated on some things that are extremely wrong. Number one, it assumes like a 3 or 4% budget deficit. And Robert, we're up to like 7% budget deficit or something like that right now. I forget exactly what interest rates. They make their assumptions of the X date for Social Security based on interest rates that are much lower than where they are today. The biggest one, CBO does not take into account a recession prior to the 2030s. How in the world can you not do that? That is going to cause massive decreases in how much people are paying into Social Security. And you're probably going to have people take Social Security early if they also lose their job. So I don't see how anyone takes these CBO dates seriously. It's going to happen before 2030. It may happen by 2028. Robert, what say you?
I don't think the Doge cleanup of the Social Security rolls is really going to have an impact on that. Like, it's not, I think there's a lot of this idea of people who support Trump in the Department of Government Efficiency that they're going to find just massive amounts of fraud, illegal fraud, and clean up the government spending and cut billions of dollars. But honestly, the most prolific parts of government spending are not fraud or necessarily technically illegal, like this USAID stuff. That is not technically illegal. The USAID did everything technically legally, but in many cases it was partisan in nature, but that's not necessarily illegal in the process they did it. So there's this idea that they're just going to cut out all this fraud, but they haven't really found very much fraud as far as like a large dollar amount of benefits going out. There were some high profile cases where they said, oh, somebody who's 128 years old or 10 people who are over 100 years old are getting Social Security payments. Sure, but that's not going to make 10 people out of how many people over the retirement age in the entire United States that get Social Security. That's nothing. So yeah, this is the Doge. The idea is sound of cutting some of this fraud out, but it's just not, I think, going to be sufficient.
Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah, I agree. I don't think they make a dent in the Social Security solvency. They're going to have, I mean, they're already talking about it. They're going to have to extend the age at which you start drawing Social Security, probably cut benefits, definitely increase what you put in. They ought to just kill Social Security altogether and privatize it. I mean, it seems to me like the smart thing to do. Unfortunately, that hasn't happened. All right. Thanks for that, Robert. All right, we'll get to a couple of last questions here. The best book you've read in the past 12 months. What are you reading right now? Man, I'm trying to make my way through several books right now. Probably the best book that I've read in the past 12 months is a book called Army of Flame. Let me Google this. It's all about the Vietnam War. It's about race relations in the Vietnam War. And you read about, everyone's familiar with how bad the Vietnam War was just at a combat warfighting level. There were riots. There was friendly fire, predominantly from black soldiers unhappy about civil rights, and they claimed racism and all these. And I did not realize how tumultuous it was. There were literal prisons in Vietnam where you had American soldiers being imprisoned by the U.S. military for friendly fire, for rioting, for insubordination, for getting in fights. And it talks about just all the civil unrest that was happening even during the conflict. A pretty wild book. And honestly, I started reading the book and I thought, oh, this is going to be, I was obviously very concerned about a political, political slant here. I was surprised at how graphic and how I'll just say this. The author is extremely blunt about exactly what happened. And it was a very good book. Yeah. An Army of Fire, Beth Bailey. How the U.S. Army confronted its racial crisis in the Vietnam era. Pretty incredible stats there in that book. All right, I think this is the last question here. Did Doge do anything significant? Seems like a lot of window dressing. They said the goal was $2 trillion. Yeah, they said the goal was $2 trillion, Robert. And then I think they said their goal was $1 trillion, and they said their goal was $150 billion. And now I think they've settled on like $30 billion or something like that. Which, I mean, round of applause. $30 billion is great. I'd rather have $30 billion than $0 billion. But I remember it was on a roundtable discussion. We ran around and said, is Doge going to be able to cut $2 trillion from the budget? And we obviously said, no, they're obviously not going to be able to do that. Any alternative take?
No, I still agree that they would never. I still think they never had a chance to cut $2 trillion from the budget, and a part of that is, I think, there's a lot of people outside of government who, like I said before, they think they're going to go in and find $2 trillion worth of fraudulent spending that just doesn't exist, and there's not really a knowledge or even appetite to cut $2 trillion of spending that is technically legitimate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, honestly, some people in the Trump administration realized just how much our economic growth was propped up by federal spending. And I think they got to the point, they said, well, if we cut federal spending, if we cut $2 trillion or even $1 trillion from federal spending, you're going to cause a massive slowdown in the economy. And I don't know. I don't know exactly what their calculus was, but I think maybe some of them, they may have realized. I don't know. Tough to say. All right. Thanks for that, Robert. This is the last question here from Gary. General tips on surviving inflation / recession, precious metals, art skills. Number one, be as self-sufficient as you can. Number one. And number two, you, by the way, I don't provide financial advice, but I do look at what the investment banks are saying, and I read the reports. And every Friday, I produce a weekly economic outlook for Early Warning Network, EWN Pro members. And what the banks have been saying going back to 2021 and 2022 is hard assets. Hard assets outperform or tend to outperform virtually everything. So yes, that would be precious metals. I don't know anything about art, but land, I mean, people are sinking lots of money into the land. All right, everyone, that's going to do it for today's show. Thanks so much for the support. We will be back in your box tomorrow morning, back on the show starting at 08 Central Time. Until then, be well and stay out front.